There are few phrases that annoy me quite as much as all relationships are transactional.
One of my favorite YouTubers, Joe Foley, recently made a video, "No, not all relationships are transactional." And that prompted me to share my view that yes, all relationships are transactional. And I want to share why this is a good thing, why this is a true and useful view, and maybe look into why some people might have a problem with that view.
I was reminded of this when watching Louis Theroux's documentary on the Manosphere.
I don't want to comment on the Manosphere documentary. That's another topic. It is somewhat related, but I want to ignore that part and I want to focus on the essence of the statement of our relationships are transactional or not, and what are the implications for my own instructions on how to live a good life.
1. The presumption of transaction. Okay, let's get the critique of this particular phrase out of the way before I look at its wider implications. Essentially, I think this phrase is what's called a deepity. This is a term coined by the philosopher Daniel Dennett that's used to describe a vague statement that has two interpretations, one of which is true but trivial, and another that is radical but false. So, everything happens for a reason is a classic deepity. It either expresses the mere idea that everything's been brought about by some kind of process, which is true, but it's also quite obvious, or it means that the world is following some kind of ultimate higher rationality, which, unless you're a theist or a stoic, is radical but false. A deepity can be really quite rhetorically powerful because you can argue for the trivial version and then just sort of act like you've proven the radical version.
I fully agree, and I think it's a fascinating and beautiful way of illustrating this deepity and potential mistake you can make. At the same time, I want to share my view that transactionality within relationships are not the same kind of deepity. It's not even a deepity, but let's try to get into that by definition.
So let's just take the phrase, all relationships are transactional. At one level, this might not only be true, but actively desirable. What would be the alternative of a transactional relationship? Would it be a totally one-sided relationship where one person gets absolutely nothing out of the pairing and the other one just parasitically takes? Well, this is hardly the model of interpersonal companionship that we want to promote. You certainly wouldn't stay with someone if being with them genuinely added nothing to your life, or at least I hope you wouldn't outside of some exceptional circumstances. Would the other person even properly love you if they wanted you to stay in that situation? So it does seem like there is some truth to the notion that all relationships are, in this sense, transactional. But the trouble is, the statement is often used to equivocate between two really different meanings of the word transactional, one of which is probably true, or mostly true, and the other of which is probably false, but is also radically cynical.
Let's examine the two definitions or two interpretations of that, and let me try to prove that they are not two different definitions or two different interpretations. They are in fact the same, and they may only differ by degree. That every parameter we would take into account is on a scale, and the only thing that may look like they are different are our interpretations of that.
The two interpretations of the statement, as far as I can see, are roughly as follows. The broad interpretation of all relationships are transactional holds that relationships are transactional in the kind of wide sense that everyone should, over the long term, get something out of the relationship.
Not only they should get something over the long term out of the relationships, it's just noticing that we are getting something of the relationship, or at least that we are hoping to get something out of the relationship. We are expecting to get some reward out of the relationship, and it is identical to every single behavior we perform. if basically it's based on the obvious yet very true and very useful and very eye-opening notion that if I didn't expect, on some subconscious level at least, to get something out of my behavior, to expect a potential reward, I wouldn't be motivated to perform that behavior. I wouldn't be motivated to attempt to make a YouTube video if I didn't expect that there is a chance that that would bring me some reward, such as being heard, such as feedback, such as interactions, such as basically some sort of reward. And it is very important for me to notice that, because I want to share that perspective helped me to battle my addiction issues, basically. Long story short, like, I was struggling because of the notion that what I'm doing is bad. It shouldn't be like this, And that created a lot of tension and a lot of suffering. And the turning point was when I noticed that there is some reward in my attempts. And, while I recognized what was attractive in that behavior, I could at least open towards the perspective. I could have opened myself towards the perspective that maybe I can replace that behavior, looking for the same kind of or similar reward. And I think the same applies to our relationships. It is a potential source of understanding yourself on a deeper level, that if I'm motivated to stay in a bad relationships, like, what is my reward? What am I getting? What am I getting out of it? Because of the obvious reasons that I am hoping to get something out of it. So what is it? Let's recognize it and let's build on that. Back to the definition.
The broad interpretation of all relationships are transactional holds that relationships are transactional in the kind of wide sense that everyone should, over the long term, get something out of the relationship. Moreover, long-term serious imbalances in what someone gets out of the relationship will likely lead to the deterioration of the relationship overall. On the other hand, the narrow interpretation of all relationships are transactional holds that relationships are tit for tat. If someone isn't getting exactly as much as you are out of a relationship, they will leave you in the immediate future.
It is technically impossible to be getting exactly as much as somebody else out of the relationship at any given period. It's unmeasurable. Basically, it's like, how can, like, even if we have whatever, like, let's say 50-50 relationship and we share the financial side of things, like, financial side of the relationship is just one of many crucial aspects of the relationship in any relationship. And I think it's important to observe that it's basically not possible to get exactly as much as somebody else out of anything, even if we go together and play football or whatever, and we both enjoy the time spent together, the cost and value looks like it's the same. It's very often similar, but it's never the same. And the closer we look at that, the more easily we'll be able to observe that.
The difference between these two positions is really quite large, and it's also largely one of time horizon. The broad version is a long-term prediction. It can accommodate pretty large periods of imbalance so long as it doesn't reach a breaking point. The narrow version, on the other hand, is a very short-term idea.
Short-term and long-term are just basically simplifications showing that everything is on a scale, like how short-term and how long-term. Do we want to analyze 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, 1 year, 10-year period of time? let's do that and let's analyze it. But it's very different kind of analysis that, does everything happen for a reason? What do you mean by that? Does everything happen for a reason because it had reasons, or because their reasons are predetermined and, there is a big order of things? That's two, maybe subtly, maybe totally different things. And there are many ways how we could classify the value exchange within the relationship and how it affects our motivations and our behaviors. And for me, one of such classifications, one that is, from my perspective, probably the more true and useful at the same time, is based on the time, past interactions, past experiences that we shared with that person. Now we are making an analysis of that relationship, of our behavior, of our motivations, and the future prediction of what can happen. And right now, the analysis is not only something that I'm making right now, but I want to notice that we are subconsciously doing it on a regular basis. We are prediction machines, and we can't help ourselves but do it. And the more in touch with our emotions are, the more we are in touch with our emotions, the more we are aware of that. The experiences, the interactions we've had in the past are not only source of our level of gratefulness, respect for another person, but also, which is more crucial in terms of transactionality and our motivations towards the relationship, are also prediction of the future value exchange. And that is, however cold it may seem, I think more than anything, it is basically true.
It suggests that even temporary imbalances in what one person is getting out of the relationship will set up a disaster.
Not necessarily. Short-term imbalance is just a short-term imbalance, and a healthy relationship is a relationship where there is a space to openly communicate our emotions related with this short-term imbalance.
It also implies an adversarial or zero-sum relationship between the pair. It assumes that if someone is getting something out of the relationship, that is coming at a cost to the other person.
There is always a cost, and there is always some value derived. Always.
Always.
In any single behavior, and so in any relationship interaction, in any relationship dynamic. There is a cost to making that video, there is a cost to you viewing that video, and there is a potential value we can both derive from that interaction. And the same applies to all our relationships.
The broad interpretation strikes me, for what it's worth, as relatively plausible for the reasons that I've already given. But people often move from the broad to the narrow interpretation without noticing the immense differences between these two ideas. The broad version should, in my view, basically invite no cynicism. It just amounts to saying that people want to feel fulfilled in their relationships, and if they are behaving reasonably, that is part of what they will pursue in their decision-making around the relationship. But the narrow version paints us all as really quite myopically egoistic agents looking to suck our romantic partners dry for all they have. Now, I've had a few romantic relationships, and while they've had their ups and downs, I can't say that this tracks my experience at all, though perhaps I've been extraordinarily lucky. As we just saw, much of the difference between the two versions is scalar.
I claim that it's not much of the difference between the two versions is scalar. I think this is the only difference.
The agents in the broad version are still deeply interested in what they can get out of a relationship, but the level of flexibility is much higher, and there's no assumption that happiness is zero-sum.
Scale of flexibility, yeah.
this allows for you to be happy for your partner. Since the difference is, for the most part, in degree rather than kind, it can seem appropriate to use the same word transactional for both. But I think this is a really quite misleading mistake, because the difference between the broad and narrow interpretation has profound behavioral consequences. If the broad version is true, we shouldn't panic. I think that actually it doesn't have any kind of detrimental effects on our view of love or humanity. But if the narrow version is true, then I'd forgive you for swearing off romance entirely. It's quite a depressing way to think.
Just that something is a depressing way to think doesn't change that it may be true, obviously.
Think about it this way. If the transactional nature of the relationship is evaluated over a very long period of time, let's say 5 years, then that's a really quite robust connection. It would take 5 years of not getting enough out of the relationship for it to collapse.
Like I said, I think it's important to emphasize that the analysis of the relationship based on the 5-year period of time, it just doesn't work like that. I think in any single moment within any relationship, this is how our body and mind work together. We are assessing the past to create as precise future as possible. And so if we were in the relationship for 5 years, we will use that 5-year period of time to predict into the future. If we knew somebody for 5 minutes, we would use that to make prediction into the future, and we would assess the situation, and based on our level of awareness, we would attempt the best step moving forward.
But if all relationships only worked on the very short time horizon implied by the narrow interpretation, say a week or a month, then it would totally rob us of the ability to be confident that any of our relationships can weather hard times.
Yeah, maybe it would rob us. But sometimes that is quite clearly the right step, you know? If, like using the analogy with a football field, you know? There are certain fouls that can be just a foul. There are certain fouls that deserve a yellow card, and there are certain fouls that deserve a red card, you know? And that rhetoric is like saying that, you know, we would have to wait for, like, I don't know, 1 season before we can give somebody a red card, you know? It just doesn't work like that. If a partner is cheating on you after 1 week of a relationship, that's quite clearly different scenario that somebody has been tired, for example, for 1 week and, you know, didn't give you as much of their presence. Healthy relationship is rich in healthy communication and ability to take responsibility for their action, you know? And if there are no signs of healthy communication and taking responsibility after 5 days, and there is no intention to learn that after 5 days, 5 minutes, 5 hours, whatever, like, why would you wait 5 years, you know? Even if it's like after 1 year, the time in this case doesn't matter, basically.
Additionally, the idea in the narrow version that relationship satisfaction is necessarily a zero-sum game just seems false. It's cynical, but it's untrue. It ignores the fact that people can enjoy doing things for their romantic partner, especially if those things are appreciated. I don't think that that's even that unusual. It seems like a very common everyday experience. Even outside of romance, I'm sure most of us have bought a gift for someone and taken pleasure in someone else receiving and enjoying the gift. And that's not to speak of all the things that couples will enjoy doing together. If a couple goes out for a walk or has a nice conversation or sleeps together, this is something that they both enjoy and doesn't cost the other anything in emotional or monetary terms. I feel like this is so obvious that it almost seems strange to say it out loud, but two people can enjoy something together without that enjoyment coming at the cost of one another.
Let's stop here, because I think that's where the essence of our subtle conflict lies. Every behavior has a cost, and every behavior has a potential value to be derived. And let's use that example that a couple goes out for a walk together and sleeps together, and they both enjoy that. Just that they both enjoy that doesn't mean that there is no difference in cost and value they both derive from that. Let's use an example of me and Mr. Foley here. Me with, I don't know, 100 subs. Well, how many subscriptions do I have? Not many, basically. Let's say we would have a recorded conversation on YouTube. And let's even hypothetically assume that we would both enjoy that conversation. Can you see where I'm getting at? We both enjoy that. But the cost we had to have this conversation is not the same. And especially the value we would potentially derive from that recorded conversation and sharing our call-up video together is not the same. And the same applies in any relationship. It's just scalar. The more closely we look at every human interaction, the more visible it will be. Generally speaking, the cost of sleeping together for a girl will be different than for a man. A commitment and long-term relationship, generally speaking, will be higher for men than for a girl. Generally speaking, that is the case. And we could talk about it for 4 hours, or we could just pause here.
When people are arguing for the transactionality of relationships, they will often argue for the broad version that is relatively unobjectionable, pretty easy to demonstrate in some form, and relatively trivial. But they will then use that point to infer all sorts of cynical conclusions about romance.
Sure, but I think that's another point, another essence where our subtle conflict lies. If we have a problem with certain conclusions about the claim, then let's fight the conclusions, not the claim. Let's fight the interpretation of the truth that we don't like, and not the truth that we agree is true. Because it's like the truth is truth. The truth is a tool we can use in many different ways. So we can interpret certain truth in many different ways, same as we can use any tool in many different ways, such as, the truth is a knife, and we can interpret the truth in many different ways, and we can use a knife to kill somebody. But in that case, let's not fight the knife. Let's fight the murder. And yeah, that's my point here. That if we do not, I would just say the same thing over and over. I'm learning. Thank you for your patience.
They've implicitly swapped from the broad version to the narrow version of this phrase. I notice this a lot in the so-called manosphere, as well as similar relationships content that's aimed at young women that's been shown to me by some of my friends. In both cases, the idea that all relationships are transactional was implicitly used to support a relationship ethic of, at best, kind of rough egoism, and at worst, outright, almost malicious exploitation.
I did say that I don't want to comment on the documentary about the manosphere and the manosphere at all, but I can see that analogy as with battling addictions. That many people that do not like the trends within the manosphere, they are not understanding, or they are not trying to understand what is rewarding for those people who get there. They're just saying this is a bad thing. Don't even go there, And I can see the analogy with addiction, that we don't like that somebody has a drinking problem, and we just say no, just don't drink, don't do that, And I think this is basically something that builds a boundary between me and a person I want to help, It just doesn't work, basically. What works from my perspective, is understanding what is rewarding, what is true, and how are we getting there, and then we can basically engage in an interaction with a person, and if we just if we do not recognize what is valuable, what is rewarding in a certain realm, then we will just not create the conversation.
The trouble in both the relationships case and the wider selfishness case is that they can become self-fulfilling prophecies.
Of course, they can become self-fulfilling prophecies, but at the same time, they can become a source of better understanding yourself, And that's what I have already presented, or at least attempted to present, that how you interpret obvious observations is not the same as observation, not the same as truth, you have noticed. The interpretation and the truth, they are not the same. The video goes on and on, but I would just keep sharing the same view I try to share. I am noticing something true and useful in the observation that all relationships are transactional. And why this is a good thing? Because the truth gives me peace of mind, I'm calm that, oh yeah, that's reality. And then I have space to contemplate on what I want to do with reality. There is no tension. There is no misalignment between me and reality. It just flows naturally. And then I can basically understand myself better. What am I getting out of this relationship? Is this healthy? Is this good for me? Is this good for another person? Can we perhaps address certain issues in a different way without fighting reality, without fighting, And it's good that we have this transaction, the transactionality, the value exchange between me and people I love is a good thing. I'm grateful for every single part of this transaction, I want to keep exchanging values with people I love, I see nothing wrong with that. I can obviously see how somebody else can interpret it in a different way. We could discuss about interpretations, and why I see that some people have a problem with that is that's my perspective, that's my perception, my suspicion perhaps. I think many people do not like this notion that all relationships are transactional and are not keen on exploring this space because they are avoiding confronting themselves. That's where the biggest source of conflicts within relationships lie, in the fear. That's how I view things. People are afraid of confronting themselves. If somebody is not happy with the value exchange, we can, what I have already shared, we can have a healthy communication about how you feel about things, how I feel about things, and what could we do about it together moving forward. We are prediction machines and we are expecting certain things and we are adapting to this, as good as we can, and yeah, thanks for listening. Thanks for your patience. I'm just learning. To be honest, I just made this video because I forgot to cancel my Riverside subscriptions. And since it was already here, I thought I would perhaps play with it a little. So yeah, thank you very much. If you are here, all the best to you. Bye-bye. Have a good transaction with your people.